This will be an update on the Marijuana Reconciliation and Taxation Act that was passed about 1 year ago, and its implications for medical practice and patients, and for the public. So you can see that I've listed 3 different things here: THC, hemp CBD, and medical marijuana, and that'll become obvious as we go along. So I don't have any conflicts of interest. I haven't bought into a marijuana retail outlet or anything of that sort. We're gonna
Let me announce, I'm going to mute everybody, and Dr. Bill can unmute whenever he wants to.
I better do that pretty soon.
You're muted, Bill.
There we are. I found it. It appears in a different place when you're screen sharing. Let's see, I got to get back to the previous page. How do I do that? There we go. So we're going to look at the act and describe what it's all about, and then contrast the various components of it: hemp, CBD, medical marijuana, what they call adult use marijuana. That's what we would call usually recreational marijuana, the type of marijuana that makes you high. Technically, it's THC, and I'll talk about that. We'll talk about rules and regulations and outline the concerns that the New York State Academy of Family Physicians and other professional groups have had along the way. So this was sort of where things were before MRTA ever was considered, MRTA, M-R-T-A, Marijuana Reconciliation Taxation Act, but MRTA for short. So prior to that, there really was no regulation of cannabinoids. A lot of illegal, illicit use, but not much about regulation. Therefore, a lot that wasn't being done about safety, purity, etc. And a dearth of independent research on it, largely because the feds classify marijuana as a highly illegal substance, making it hard to get it, to do research with it. And that still continues to be the case, except for CBD. But the states have taken the lead and taken the initiative. So THC is tetrahydrocannabinol. That's the, as I mentioned, the principal psychoactive cannabinoid. There are a lot of chemicals in the marijuana plant, as all the botanists of you out there would appreciate. Cannabidiol, CBD, is one of them. And that's the chemical that is purported to have medicinal benefits. And then there's hemp CBD, which is a botanical class of it. And it's usually finds its way to over-the-counter retail products. So that's what you see when you go into these stores and they're advertising CBD stuff. So it's really true, I think, that participation in the rules and regulation making process is key to avoiding historical mistakes. Once a law is passed, the law is really very, very general. Most laws are very, very general. And it's only when you get to the rules and the regulations that you really get to the nitty gritty. And that's what governs the impact of a law and seeks to avoid untoward negative effects of a law. That's where we are with MRTA. We've achieved some rules and regulation making, but there's a lot yet to be done. So it was created, as I mentioned, about a year ago. It's an independent office within the State Liquor Authority, not the New York State DOH, Department of Health. And it's concerned with medical cannabis, the adult use cannabis, and cannabinoid hemp, 3 different areas. Its appointments to the board to get it started were delayed last late spring and summer. Cuomo, for some reason or another, probably linked to some political card game he was playing, did not appoint administrators to the Office of Cannabis Management, and therefore things didn't really get started. until Hochul in the late summer, early fall made the first key appointments. When it started getting going, the first thing it tackled was the hemp CBD rules and regulations, because those were sorrowfully lacking in control. And then secondly, began on THC and recreational marijuana, and those are being addressed now. So it's governed by a board, and the board is appointed, as a lot of these are, some by the governor, some by the Senate, some by the Assembly. They turn over every 3 years theoretically, but they're meant to geographically and demographically represent the state. And then we'll see later why this is important. Communities affected by the war on drugs and disadvantaged by the history of marijuana. There is an Office of Cannabis Management. There's an executive director, a chief equity officer, a deputy director of public health and safety. And then there's an advisory board, and that's 13 people, well, from a very disparate set of backgrounds. A number of them professionals and a number of them meant to represent communities. It's got a budget and it has to submit an annual report of its progress to date. So there are some overriding principles for the act. It seeks to avoid vertical integration. So if you want to be a grower, you can't also be a producer or have a retail outlet. Similarly, if you're a retail outlet, you can't be in the business of producing the drugs. That's ostensibly to avoid monopoly. And secondarily, it's to pass the jobs around so that communities that have been disadvantaged can get some benefit from this new market that's been opened up. It's supposed to also recognize and mitigate unfavorable public health effects. We'll talk about those. And of course, you've heard about revenues, and it's supposed to be such a boon for the state's coffers. But the last point, effectively competing with the illicit market, is a key one. It does little good if you come up with a better mousetrap, but it costs too much. And if the illicit market can undercut the newly regulated legitimate market, they won't have achieved what we're looking for. So I mentioned hemp CBD were first tackled. MRTA repealed the previous program from public health law that had been and was chaptered in 2020 and put it within the consolidated cannabis law. And it made changes. It would permit the sale of hemp flower in the program, which was previously banned. It strictly regulated that smokable forms of cannabinoid hemp could only be sold by adult use retail stores. That was similar to our tobacco programs of the past decade, trying to move tobacco out of the adolescents and young adults getting exposed to it. And then the growing of it would continue to be regulated by the Department of Ag and Markets. So the proposed regulations were published in the state register, and then there was a 60-day comment period, and they were adopted in early winter, I should say, I guess, of this past winter. All these regulations generally go through a public comment period. That may be written comments only, or it may be public hearings as well. Medical marijuana has been established for a while. Not much changed with the medical marijuana program with the creation of MRTA. It can be dispensed by designated dispensaries, of which there are about 6 in New York State. Federal law moved CBD, but only CBD, out of Schedule I of controlled substances. Schedule I is the most strict control of substances, in that, for example, you would find heroin. In 2014, the Compassionate Care Act of 2014 was repealed and replaced, and medical conditions were added to the list of qualifying ones. It the new act removed the prohibition of smoking CBD by medical participants. I have mixed feelings about that. Smoking anything is not good for you, including medical marijuana. So I think that's a sad message that we have to do that to compete with the illicit market. And then it mandates the Office of Cannabis Management to increase the number of organizations in underserved and underrepresented communities, ones that had suffered under previous laws. And it sets out regulations about who can cultivate at home, how much can they cultivate of their own cannabis, how many plants can you have, and so on, and made other technical changes in the law. It's key to recognize here, excuse me, that if you're wanting to use medical CBD from a dispensary and get the benefit of having a product that's strictly regulated, is pure, has been tested for purity, and is dispensed by someone knowledgeable about the product to advise you, that you need a certification from a practitioner. This is not a prescription. It's not the same as what you take to the drugstore. It's a certification where a practitioner says that the condition you have, they believe would be benefited from CBD. So dispensaries are still a limited number. I said 6 earlier, I'm sorry, there's 40. And as of April, or early April, you see the number of practitioners and certified patients across the state. So, and to give you an idea where they are, this is sort of a screenshot of places where there are dispensaries. You have to travel to get to one, obviously, especially if you're in the southern tier or Steuben County, so on. So if we contrast hemp, CBD, and medical marijuana, the cannabinoid hemp program seeks to regulate an established industry in New York State, one that's been going for a while. Since 2015, the cultivation of hemp has been legal in the state. And in order to enact consumer protections and continue to regulate and license entities, they brought it under the Office of Cannabis Management. It's distinct from medical marijuana in that there's some variation in what products are available in each of them. And some product offerings in medical marijuana exclusively contain CBD, but there are some options that have a mixed ratio with THC for those that are thought to be beneficial to have that. And the common threshold for an allowable THC in cannabinoid hemp is only 0.3% on a dry weight basis. So it strictly regulates in the cannabinoid hemp program, the THC. And then I mentioned the other factors. So medical indications for CBD use and routes of use are points of contention and also changing. In my mind, there are only about 3 good indications with data to support use of CBD: chronic pain, muscle spasms due to multiple sclerosis, and nausea from chemotherapy. In terms of chronic pain, it's probably no better than ibuprofen or any of the other non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. So it's not a panacea. There's a lot of indications out there, you'll see. And in fact, the program basically now has said, if a practitioner thinks you could benefit from CBD, they can write you a certificate. So there are a lot of things without good data. But what disturbs me is, of course, that it's allowed to be used in smokable or vaping forms. And we know that those continue to have problems, that route of administration. So let's turn to THC, adult use marijuana, as it's called under MRTA. There are areas of concern that are multiple, ranging, as you see, from growing through processing, through retail sales, packaging, marketing, advertising, and home safety, and public education. What do people need to know to use this product in an informed way and avoid problems? So this is where we get to where I think it links to to the video that Ken showed us, a balancing act. You know, that classical head sliding down that square block and getting balanced just at the right moment. Back in 2018, the state did a survey and a study of THC with regard to the question, should it be regulated? And concluded that the pervasiveness of THC in the state was significant, and that it was having untoward effects and needed to be addressed. And so the question was how to intelligently approach this, given its widespread use. That there were a lot of New Yorkers who were using marijuana in the previous 30 days. A lot of 18-year-olds reported that it's very easy to obtain, not much easier than alcohol. And we knew there were risks. States that either didn't regulate it or regulated it poorly, susceptible people could get psychosis. For those of you who, it's a little bit of a technical term, psychosis is basically losing touch with reality. So it's a profound mental status change. It isn't just being a little confused or anxious or depressed. It's a really terrible situation. And if you have a mental health history, you're at higher risk. There also is some risk of dependency, range of estimates, but it's not without some dependency risk. And then we were seeing in states that reported this data, acute overuse, overdose syndromes and deaths, unintentional suicides. One of the things that makes it difficult is that, I'm going to take a little drink here, is that there are many ways you can get this stuff into your body. And edibles not only look a lot different than what we used to think is marijuana, but they act a lot differently than when you inhale THC. So this graph is intended to depict inhaling one joint, 15 milligrams, showing the rise in delta and delta 9 THC, which comes up to a high peak about 10 minutes after you inhale it and falls off fairly rapidly at an hour and 13 minutes. If you ingest 20 milligrams, one chocolate cookie, the time to peak is now 2 hours, 30 minutes. And it doesn't fall off for a long, long time. You see how this graph runs out to 24 hours. Those of you know something about dosing and half-lives would right away recognize that there's a lot of difference between these two products, two routes of taking in, I should say. Let me skip over this a little bit because that gets a little bit more into the weeds than we need to do. But let me say that the routes of dosing for these products range from oral liquids and solids, edibles as we saw, and inhalation, either combustion and inhalation or vaping and inhalation. And vaping, prior even to THC getting involved in it, we recognized pretty quickly, this is from 2019 as you see, was causing its own kind of lung illness. And we know that COPD, cancer, bronchospasm, asthma, chronic bronchitis, all linked to inhalation of anything. But one of the problems with edibles is, what is the right edible dosage for me? How do I dose myself with edible THC? And if you've been used to inhalation THC, which acts very quickly and falls off fairly quickly, you might be very frustrated if you didn't know better, that when you took your edible, you didn't feel anything for a while. Well, let me go back and just finish that thought. The temptation then would be, oh, well, let me eat some more. I must not have had enough. And then, oh, well, maybe I should have even some more. One piling up on another. And so at the 2-hour, 30-minute mark, when things peak, you stood a risk of being overdosed, and that overdosage lasting for quite a while. And that could lead you to being psychotic, and that could lead you to doing something you wouldn't ordinarily do. So the public needs to be informed. There's a lot of controversy, and this was part of the problem in getting MRTA passed. Is THC a gateway drug to harder drugs? Well, in point of fact, there's a lot of things that can lead to other drugs, not just alcohol, but even nicotine. We don't think about these as being gateway drugs for, for other drugs, but a point in fact is that they are. And marijuana is certainly not any more of a gateway drug than these things are. So, rules and regulations. THC first tackled the issues for growers. It was a matter of timing somewhat. If you don't have a crop in the ground by a reasonable time in the spring, you won't harvest a crop this year. And then, there'll be really nothing to be done about this market for another year. So they attacked the agricultural piece of it at this point in early spring. Then it also went on to, even before that actually, to allow municipalities to opt out of one or another or both of two entities created by the law. Those were a retail sales outlet, and the second was what's called a consumption facility. Think of it as a bar for alcohol. So municipalities had until the end of the year to do so. And as I say, they could choose which to opt out of. If they opted out, later on they could opt in. But if they opted in, they could not opt out in the future. So it's a little difficult because the rules and regulations for THC hadn't been created at that point. So what am I dealing with? That's what the municipalities could ask. So what happened? Well, by the end of the year, 774 opted out and of retail sales, and 883 opted out of consumption sites. And across the county, results differed depending upon where you were, what your town did, or your village, or the city.
Bill, what exactly is a consumption site?
Well, think of it as a bar for alcohol. You go in, you buy the product to be consumed right there. So we touched on these points already. I mentioned that drafts are typically not available. I didn't mention this. They're not typically available for review before they're released for public comment. So the advisory board, the committees of the Office of Cannabis Management are working on these things. We don't generally aren't aware what's in them until they release them for public comment. But at that point, one can weigh in. So I mentioned that it seeks to avoid vertical integration. There are a multiplicity of license types, as you can see here under bullet 2, and all of them are subject to being compliant with quality control measures, consumer protections, public health standards, lab testing to ensure the product contains what it says it does, and then labeling and marketing and advertising. And we'll get into why that's important. And also, are the licenses distributed in a manner that helps to achieve the law's goal of a social and economic equity program? So what about the revenue? Well, here you see the breakdown in where the revenues are made and how they're split. And you can see that they're distributed from cities up to the state, and that some of it is based just on sales dollars, but some is based on THC content. The taxes that come in are, of course, intended to cover the cost of running the program. And then there are some that go to a community grant reinvestment fund, again, part of the social equity program, some to drug treatment, and of course, public education, and then 40% to other public education programs. So what does this mean? Well, you're talking about media presence, print, social networking on social media, public education at the venues where products are sold, a lot of different places. So the drug treatment and public education fund is farmed out to the OASIS, the office. I'm not going to be able to give you the breakdown of the acronym, but OASIS basically is the head honcho in New York State for substance problems, substance treatment. And that's dispersed in consultation with other commissioners, and it's intended to have different foci, as you see here, to reduce the risk of cannabis and substance use by school-age children, but also to avoid problems in older people too. There's an emphasis on programs that are culturally and gender competent, evidence-based. It's required to submit an annual written report talking about what they've done with that money. One of the big stumbling blocks is right here, isn't it? Traffic safety concerns have been a big part of the concern about legalizing THC at all. This law does provide for funding for basic research into this, looking at pre and post MRTA, what's the impact on traffic safety, and helping to devise and fund technologies to detect cannabis impaired drivers. Hopefully something like a breathalyzer for alcohol. And then at the present time, the best we have is really officers that are specially trained to recognize a substance affected driver and providing additional funding for training those law enforcement people. So it specifies, as you might guess, who can grow THC at home and how much of it can they grow. It specifies that if you smell marijuana, it's not a probable cause to arrest somebody, except if they're operating a motor vehicle. And it talks about when home growing of cannabis can go into effect. And you can see that there are various trigger points for that to happen that only take effect as the program rolls out. And then these provisions, you can't use THC and smoke and vape it if you're not allowed to use tobacco that way there. You still retain rights if you're a landlord about it. And you can't use it while you're operating a motor vehicle. So it defines certain penalties for unlawful sale, criminal sale, different degrees of that. But most importantly, I guess I shouldn't say most, but significantly, it created an automatic expungement or resentencing if you were charged and convicted with a previous marijuana statute. And that would, if that usage would have now been legal. So a lot of people had their records criminal records revised. So one of the things we've seen is in 2018, THC was legalized in Canada. 3 years later, legal sales outpaced unlicensed sales. That's a good thing. However, 25% of people 16 years and older consume it. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? I guess it depends upon how we see the future. I certainly don't like seeing 16 years to 21 or even 25 increased use happening. That's a very vulnerable point of time for people's brains. And they've seen just an incredible burgeoning of retail shops happening in Toronto. Certainly not all of them are going to continue to exist, but it's quite a fact. So I've listed here some of the risks, some of which I'm sure you know of. One of the things that's clear is that anatomically speaking, structurally speaking, the brain can be affected by substances, not just marijuana, but other substances as well. We're talking about what we think might be permanent changes. And we talked about some of these other things, and then there are special considerations with regard to pregnancy. So for physicians, I think medical marijuana, they have a challenge to determine if they think the person in front of them would benefit from CBD. For THC, I think they have a challenge in explaining to the person in front of them how marijuana could have a deleterious effect on them, and then how to properly use it if they're going to, and why they should seek a regulated product rather than getting something off the illicit market. And that's a big challenge to get that across. And that's a challenge to us in public health and a challenge to the entire system. So that's a thumbnail sketch of the law, some of the implications of it. You can see the $ superimposed on the marijuana leaf. There's a lot of money to be made in this arena. It could be made by unscrupulous sellers, and the act is trying to avoid what other states have seen as mistakes and ensure that public health and safety are respected in this regard. So thanks very much.
Bill,
Thanks, Bill.
there was a program on 60 Minutes, I think it was, how marijuana, THC, I don't know which one, was a great help to people with long-term battle-related PTSD. You know anything about that?
I don't know anything about the data of it. I'm sorry to say, Peter. It'd probably be CBD that you're talking about, I would imagine, but I'm not sure.
Yeah. I understand that most of the THC is in the flowers, but nothing you said referred to the use of flowers versus the use of the whole plant.
Yeah, I believe it is allowed under what MRTA is conceiving. I think flowers will be allowed. They certainly are now allowed in hemp CBD.
To what extent is it considered that legalization may remove the stigma of a criminal conviction for somebody who uses or deals in marijuana?
Well, for those people who were convicted before, that conviction disappears from their record. So from the legal and law enforcement arm of the world, that would now be absent as they go forth, should they ever have another run-in with the law. For people who stick within the law of MRTA and only raise for themselves or sell, I should say, raise for themselves or grow, use THC within the limits or CBD within the limits that the law prescribes, that certainly isn't an offense. But if they exceed those limits, yes, they can be charged and fined for those infractions.
So is New York State now in violation of federal law?
Yeah, technically, but that's what's been happening for a long time. As states well before us legalized THC, and the feds have turned a blind eye to that. I think recognizing that this isn't the same sort of thing as heroin, for example, or cocaine. And of course, there are lots of arguments about those substances and what we should do about them as well. But yeah, it's technically illegal federally.
There was a book that came out about 5 years ago I think it was Tell All Your Children. And it was somewhat of a sensationalist, but was looking at a historical and also recent perspective on increased rates of psychotic admissions to emergency rooms and the dangers of in a relatively small percentage of the population, but nonetheless generating an increased amount of emergency room visits and hospitalizations for psychosis. And the best estimate I could derive from that book was that your chances of developing psychosis in those are perhaps amplified 3 to 5% by the regular use of THC. And so that still makes it a relatively low incidence, but it seemed fairly clear that there was an increased chance of developing psychosis with THC use. So
if you're in the subpopulation of somebody who has a mental health diagnosis, that percentage is higher. So
right, absolutely. But he was also indicating a increased incidence of de novo psychosis with THC use, and so most people don't know they are prone to psychosis until it finally happens.
I think as grandparents, the things I would talk about with my children and to tell their children are a number of things. Number one, I'd make sure they know about this potential impact on developing brains. That you don't want to be using this stuff when you're trying to go to university or get through high school. I would talk to them about edibles. That picture of the cupcake is only one example of a very tempting product that any child would take to be a yummy thing to get into.
Mm-hmm.
And those things need to be put safely away. If they're going to have THC in their houses, they need to regard it as a drug. They need to put those edibles out of reach. They need to maybe lock them up even. One of the things the Act will do and is in the process of doing is define how products are packaged, what they can look like, how they have to be labeled, so that it clearly is not resembling something that kids, and by kids I mean adolescents as well, young children, would typically think of as a yummy. And the product would have to have labeling in a large enough font to show that this is a THC product. And a lot of other features in terms of how do these things get advertised? Stay out of markets that are viewed by adolescents and young children. Stay out of venues where you're going to be appealing to the wrong people. So I think the advisory board is composed of very good people who are going to have their finger on the pulse of this and hopefully avoid mistakes. The calls to poison control centers for children under 5 who accidentally ingested THC has significantly escalated over the last 5 years as we've seen more and more THC out there. So Mario, you had a question.
Just a quick question, Bill. You walk down through the commons on any given evening and you can smell the smoke.
Mhm.
Is that, I mean, how long would I have to spend down there to get high on secondhand smoke?
No, so from what point of view are you asking that question, Mario?
Well, you know, I smell secondhand cigarette smoke and I don't worry about getting cancer.
Well, I think you could probably think about it in the same way, I suppose.
Okay.
I don't know the answer to that, but I don't think you're going to get significantly high passing by him. No.
I wouldn't ride in a car with him.
Yeah, right.
Right. Yeah.
Interestingly, I remember from college days and reading about this, the THC, to my memory, is a serendipitous. The psychoactive effect is serendipitous. The cannabinoid is an oil that's produced by the plant to reduce water loss from the plant during the dry season. And so its effect, the reason the plant has it is purely to preserve water content in arid environments, and the fact that it's psychoactive to mammals and other animals is purely circumstantial and chance.
I know that it's those of you out there who are botanists, I think probably know this already, that back in the 70s, the plant, I think, was somewhere around 3-5% THC or something. But they've been able to engineer them now to be 20% THC and all sorts of miracles of chemistry.
Selective breeding.
So it's just not the same stuff as we saw around in the 60s and the 70s. It's a completely different thing. And that's why I think it's important not to talk about marijuana, but to talk about THC. It's a chemical, it's a substance, and if we get away from the word marijuana, we won't be thinking about it in the benign way that typically we have in the past, the remote past, perhaps.
Thank you, Dr. Bill.
Very good.
Yeah.
Very enlightening. What a thorough overview.
Good to be with you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bill.
Yeah.
What do we have?